welcome back to another episode of Fantasy Baseball Camp. This is episode 30. We got Tommy in the camp tonight. We got myself in the camp tonight. Michael and Coach Avery, look, they had more important things to do, couldn't make it. So Tommy and I are going to go through some statistics, some things we pay attention to when we're looking at waiver wire, ads, when we're looking at some other things, but really just some statistics that mean a lot to us, some that we like, some that we don't like, and just kind of explain a little bit and why they're relevant to fantasy. So, Tommy, let's dive right in, man. What are some things that you like when you're paying attention to players that you want to watch or that you are watching? Like, give me a stat that you really like to pay attention to, hitter or pitcher.
Well, this probably isn't my favorite one to look at, but I think it's the easiest one to start with explaining statistics in baseball versus like expected statistics. That's kind of a new thing with Statcast introduced in 2015. We started to collect data. I mean, there's hundreds of games every year combined from all the 30 teams, and you can really get a good law of averages and kind of estimate what a player may do based off of a hit or how the ball is hit. And that's kind of where batting average versus expected batting average comes into play. So, I mean, everybody knows the batting average calculation. You get a hit, it's worth 1,000% or 1%. If you don't, it's zero. And so that happens 100 times. If a guy gets 40 hits out of 100 plate appearances, he's got a 400 batting average. About as simple as it gets in all statistics. But expected batting average is not that way. And basically how the formula comes out to be is we've got 8 years of data now, StatCast, that says, all right, this guy hit the ball at 98 miles per hour, had a 12-degree launch angle, and it was hit at this direction in the field, maybe towards the left fielder. And 99% of the time, that bounces right in front of him, and the player gets a single. So that's expected to be a hit, expected to be a single. Vice versa, the guy pops it up 75 miles an hour to the pitcher in the infield. 99% of the time, that's going to be an out, so it's expected 0 out of 1 on your outs. And so when those hits are done over that quality of hit and type of hit is done 1,000 times, you get statistical, numbers that says this is what it should be. So we expect this hit, this quality content to be this batting average. And you actually, interesting enough, you can see that in a live game, every at bat gives you an expected batting average, not just an expected batting average for a player over their course of the year, but every at bat has an expected hit. So home runs obviously expected 1,000. It's something fun to watch. But anyways, I dove deep on that to say that sometimes that doesn't always tell us the full story. So as you and I were talking before about why a player's batting average versus expecting batting average may be so different. And I find that intriguing at times. So the best example of that is Tony Kemp, not a fantasy relevant player, but maybe a help explanation of why it's so different. His batting average is 179, but his expected batting average is 237. And so what that tells me is that he's gotten really unlucky, and per his expected numbers, he should have more hits than he should, or than he should, or what I'm trying to say, than he does.
Yeah, so his expecting batting average is, you said, lower than his actual batting average?
His actual batting average is lower than his expected numbers, which means he's been very unlucky. But if you look at it, he hits the ball at 85 miles an hour average exit velocity, which is 3 miles per hour lower than league average. So he doesn't hit the ball hard, and so that's why he's not getting many hits. And additionally, his BABIP is 189, and league average is 296. And so the fact that he doesn't hit the ball hard, and he,
okay, so I'm going to interrupt you just for a second, so that I'm going to read what MLB has as a definition for expected batting average, right? So each batted ball is assigned an XBA, X batting average, based on how often comparable balls, in terms of exit velocity, launch angle, and on certain types of batted balls, sprint speed, have become hits since StatCast was implemented. So do you feel like, based on that definition, that a guy like Tony Kemp, because he has a higher sprint speed, but he doesn't hit the ball very hard, he might be awarded a higher XBA because he's hitting soft liners that, might get caught, or a soft ground ball that it's say, XBA says, well, this was beat out by most players with your speed. Do you feel like that's kind of the case for a Tony Kemp?
I don't know. That one's hard to tell because he's just so bad of a player. But he's not beating those balls out. So I think the quality of contact is just so poor. He just doesn't hit the ball hard at all. That even when it says, yeah, this should have been a hit, it's not, because maybe Statcast just doesn't have data that poor to match up to it.
Yeah, and I'll give you another extreme case, right? And we talked about it beforehand. So like Bobby Witt Jr. is his average is 244, but his XBA is 287. Like that's a vastly different batting average than expected batting average. Whereas the guy next to him on the list, Wander Franco, two very similar players, right? I think Wander Franco might have a little more power, but Bobby Witt has a better max EV. So Wander Franco has a 282 batting average and a 289 expected batting average. So basically, everything that Wander Franco hits that is supposed to be a hit becomes a hit. Whereas for Bobby Witt, everything that's supposed to become a hit doesn't become a hit. So it looks to me like Bobby Witt has been a little more unlucky. Would you, say that's accurate?
Yeah, I would absolutely say it. What he's doing now doesn't match up to what I think he can do. I think he's definitely been unlucky. Um, that
Yeah.
I think another thing that doesn't get factored into the Statcast error as much as it, or the data as it should, is the Statcast expected numbers use data from years past, but what they're not taking into account is current education experience data, whatever it may be, used by current MLB players and MLB teams, is taking shifts into account. Every player has a card in their pocket or in their hat that says, hey, for this guy, stand right here. Or for the past 6 years, when a guy hits a ball that hard in this direction, this angle, hits a hit every time. But now
Yeah.
players are standing exactly where that player is going to hit the ball because we have data that tells them that. And so I think that's one thing in a flaw with the expected stats that may take some time to catch up to it itself.
Yeah. So, like you're saying, look, we've always said, and everybody hears it, it's kind of cliche. This is a game of inches, right? The game of baseball is a game of inches. So, the left fielder's playing, 2 feet in, and the ball gets hit over his head, and a ball that, 99 times out of 100 is caught, right? It goes for his batting average, but it goes against his X batting average because 99 times out of 100, that hit was caught. But because he was playing 2 steps in, that batted ball is now a double, right? So I think I would agree with you there. I think that doesn't necessarily take into account defensive alignment as accurate as it possibly could. So I don't know. I mean, are you? So let's just kind of put a bow on this. Are you for expected stats when it comes to fantasy like relevancy?
I think early on in the season, I'll look at them, which I'm going to contradict myself because half of this season now, we're almost the All-Star break. You can only be unlucky for so long. You become a player, you know what you are. Your expected stats, maybe you're supposed to be 100 points better, but you're not. I don't care about that anymore. For 80 games, you have not been good. I don't care to see if you're going to be good. Early in the season, and this is why I'm going to contradict myself, I do care about expected stats a little bit more because maybe you have had bad luck. Maybe you will be a better player, but the sample sizes are small and the data can be skewed. You don't normalize data until you have a bunch of data sets. So I think it's a case-by-case basis. But this far in the season, I don't really care about expected stats
Yeah,
for a player who's played.
but like you mentioned, right? So expected stats might be something that you reference at draft time, where this tells you what you can expect, uh, probably from a player during the season, right? But once you get into the season and you realize this player is having a good season, bad season, I guess for me, expected stats can tell you whether a guy's having good luck or bad luck, but for fantasy relevance and for especially leagues that are points league like our league, if that event didn't actually occur, then you don't get points for it. So if I hit a ball that is a hit 90 times out of 100, but those 10 times my player hit that ball and didn't get the points for it because it got caught, then that doesn't actually get me points, so
Exactly.
it didn't actually happen. So for me, I really only care about the reality of the statistic. Um, and because the expected stats don't get me points and don't win me that game that week
They don't have
or
an expect.
that matchup.
They don't have an expected Hall of Fame.
There we go. Look, that's the best way to finish that. So there is
Well,
no expected Hall of Fame.
I have one more curious case I think is super
Okay.
fantasy relevant right now. And there's a guy named, you may have heard of him, Luis Ariz. He's chasing this thing, trying to hit 400, right?
Yeah.
Well, his batting average right now, just short of 400, is 397. But his expected batting average is 337, which is almost 60 points lower than what the
Right.
actual average batting average says. So to me, that says he's gotten lucky. He's going to have a high BABIP. He hits the ball hard. Um,
Well, I'm
and
gonna stop you there.
he's super fast. That's what the data would tell me.
Right.
But
Yeah. Exactly.
but I look at information. He's got a high BABIP. It's 410, one of the highest in the whole league. So when he puts the ball in play, he's getting a hit. But his sprint speed is 27 percentile, super low. His average exit velocity is horrible. I mean, it's 34 percentile. So he doesn't hit the ball
Yeah.
hard. He's not fast, but his
Yeah.
BABIP's high. So why is it
And
expected?
his
Why is
to
it?
add
Why,
to that, his hard hit percentage is 23%, which is among the lowest in the league.
so I think the reason the expected batting average is so low, not so low, it's 337. It's still amazing.
Yeah. Matter of
But
fact, he's fourth worst in hard hit percentage among qualified hitters.
but I think what's going on here is that he doesn't hit the ball hard and he's not fast. And every single time that should be an out. But what it's not taking into account is his skill of quality of contact to just place the ball.
Yep.
So it's a hard soft hit, but it's in between spots that players going to get. And so that's another flaw in the expected stat is like, do I think he's going to hit 400 all year? No, I don't. He's done it for half the year, but I don't think he's 337 because a formula doesn't take into account the talent level it takes for a guy just to slap hit to a
Yeah.
single every single time.
To be able to take that 98-mile-an-hour fastball on the outer half and just kind of throw your hands at it to hit a little blooper over the third baseman's head and get a double out of it, right?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't take that into account, right? So you get a guy like Arise who is, arguably, if not clearly, the best pure just hitter in the game right now. Yeah, he's going to get a lot more hits than he probably should because on those events, those aren't hits for 99% of the league, and he's just one of those outliers, right?
Yeah. I just think that's interesting how sometimes we've got why we don't necessarily always trust statistics because you're not going to put Luis Ariz's value, which is almost nothing. He has almost no value if all he do is hitting 300. He doesn't
Yeah.
steal. He doesn't hit home runs. He's not a counting stat machine. He has almost little value because he gets one run every single 1 point every single game.
Right.
Or not one but 7 from hits. He holds value.
All right, so let's move on. Let's talk about maybe a stat that you do pay attention to. When you're trying to start your lineup, or maybe you're trying to add a player. Like, what's that stat? Let's talk about a pitcher, right? So we talked about expected batting average. Let's talk about a pitching stat. What's one that you go to when you're looking to pick up a player, maybe on the waiver wire?
Yeah, I look at a comparison of the ERA versus the FIP quite often. The
Okay.
ERA is a statistic as old as time, and the formula for that is just the earned runs that the batter gives up or pitcher gives up times 9 divided by the innings pitched. Super simple. League average is probably somewhere around 4.6, but the ace guys you're looking at 3 ERA, which basically tells you every time they pitch 9 innings, they'll give up on average 3 runs. And a lot of times that data is skewed because they'll have one blow up game where they give up 10 runs, and then for the rest of the season, it's inflated. And so you can't just look at ERA blanketly and say this guy's good or this guy's bad. So there's another tool. I'm not sure how long it's been around, but it's not been forever. FIP, which stands for Fielding Independent Pitching, and the formula for that is a lot more complicated. I'm gonna say it, but you're probably gonna want to look it up. It's 13 times the number of home runs they give up plus 3 times their hit batters plus walks, minus 2 times their strikeouts, dividing by their ending pitch, plus a constant of 3.2.
Yeah, and I think I know that is pretty complicated, especially if you're not a math guy, right? Like Tommy and I are nerds, all right. So like I kind of like the formulas and how they come up with expected stats and regular stats and FIP and WHIP and ERA and WOBA, whatever, right? But I think what FIP is trying to quantify is just a singular stat that can provide you the value in one way or another, a weighted value for what a pitcher can control. Is that, your feeling of it? Because they're weighting it with different numbers to give different values for strikeouts versus hits and earned runs, right?
Yeah. So, like we said before, a player is positioned out of position and a ball gets hit. He should have caught it. He didn't. Well, that run, that pitcher gives up a hit. The next guy gets another hit. He scores a run. Is that really his fault because the guy was out of position?
Right.
Is it his fault that the third baseman fumbled it? It's not going to be an error, but the third baseman just kind of flipped it out of his glove and didn't make the play. He's just going to get a hit. Is it his fault that it was raining that day and the guy was slow or slipped the ball? They're, again, not errors, but they're going to get earned runs for it. So
Yeah.
what FIP really does is just measures the quality of a pitcher by his strikeouts, his walks, and the home runs he gives up. Because those are the things he can control. He can't control what the third baseman does. He can control what the outfielder does.
Yeah, and I'm gonna build off that and kind of go off a simpler stat. I like WHIP, just walks and hits per inning pitched, mainly for the same reasons where a pitcher can control what his WHIP is, right? If you're giving up a lot of hits, you're giving up a lot of walks, right? Your ERA is going to be pretty inflated. That's just going to kind of take care of itself, right? But for the most part, WHIP isn't really a formula like FIP is. It's not as predictive as FIP is, but it's more counting stats based, right? So walks and hit burning pitch, that is what a pitcher does. That's everything within his control. A lot of times he might not have control over whether a run scores or not, right? It's a ball's hit hard and the relay's botched, and even though they have a great chance to get him out at the plate, like that's an earned run that counts for him. That maybe because there's bad defense, that goes against his ERA, right? Whereas WHIP doesn't really take that into account. So if you got a guy that's got a WHIP in like the sub 1.2, that's really good. If you got a guy that's a sub 1 WHIP, that's elite.
Yeah, I really like WHIP. You're saying like 1.2 or 0.12. If I see a guy with like a 0.97 WHIP, I get really excited because he's limiting the number of hits he gives up, and he probably doesn't walk a lot of people. And
Yeah.
so in a points league, I mean that's super important because if you're not walking people, you're probably not getting your pitch count up. You probably can go deeper in innings or deeper in the games or pitch more innings. You're not giving up hits, and every time you give up a hit, it's a lost point, potentially lost runs, gives you a loss. You're not going to get the win. I mean, that may be one of the more valuable stats
Yeah.
when
And
looking at fantasy.
another reason that I like WHIP is because a lot of times a guy that is like a flamethrower, they might have a higher WHIP because they have less control, right? So it doesn't really matter whether you're a flamethrower or not. A good WHIP means you know how to pitch, right?
Yeah, I saw something the other day that said, "I don't care how fast you can throw a ball for,"
Yeah, exactly.
and it
And
stuck with me. I was like, "Yeah,
man, that's a great saying. We're gonna have to take that on. And
yeah,
honestly, I love WHIP more than ERA. I feel like ERA is not a good predictor of fantasy relevancy. And I'll give you a perfect example, okay? Sonny Gray. All right. And I say this because he's on my team. All right. So Sonny Gray, since week 5, we're in week 13. Since week 5, has scored over 10 points twice. Right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's 9 starts since week 5, and he scored over 10 points twice. Now, granted, a lot of that has to do with the fact that he's pitched really well and hasn't gotten the win because the Twins didn't score many runs. He has very bad run support, but Sonny Gray right now has a 2.67 ERA. I mean, he's number 7 in ERA in the league, right? So you look at his ERA and you're like, oh, he's having a great year, which he was the first 4 weeks, and he's still considered a Cy Young candidate. But if we're talking about fantasy relevance, especially if you're in a points league, like, look, man, over the last, 8 weeks, he has not been good. And, that's not entirely his fault. He doesn't get any run support. but he also just doesn't go deep into games. He doesn't
So
strike
what's
out
his
that
whip?
many guys, right? Uh, so let me go. Let me look that up.
Yeah, we're talking about whip, and you talk about his 2 something ERA. I thought you're leading to a point where his whip's
Yeah, so
1.5 or something.
I was gonna get to that, but I had the wrong page up. I had the actual standard page up instead of the other one up. So where are you?
I find it interesting what you say here, though, because it is interesting. How can a guy have a 2.5 ERA if his whip's high, which means he's getting a bunch of guys on base, but he's not, but they're not scoring, which is a high stranded rate, which is good. But you're losing points every game for those guys on base. So all it takes is one bad inning where those guys get on base and they
Okay,
score, you lose the
yeah.
game.
So he has a 1.29 whip, which is
That's high tie for a
good.
2.5 ERA guy.
Yeah, like that's above average, right? Like that's okay. That's not great for a guy with a 2.6 ERA. Like I would expect that whip to be more like a
A one.
1.0, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So he
Yeah.
doesn't
I think
strike out that many guys. He walks some people on top of the fact that he doesn't get much run support, and yeah, like it looks good on paper, but when it comes down to it, like it's one of those things where like, especially me, like right now, I'm stuck in this thing of I want to start Sonny Gray because his counting stats look good. But when it comes down to it, like he just doesn't score that many points for those reasons, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think another tail sign, a good example of that was Edward Cabrera before he went in the IL. And I rostered him for a quarter of the season before I gave up on him, but his whip was like 1.5 or something before when I dropped him. He put 10 strikeouts a game, no problem whatsoever, but he had no clue where the ball was going. He'd walk 4 or 5 guys a game. He gave up a couple of hits. He'd end up with 1 or 2 innings every game where the bases get loaded, and he walks 1 or 2 guys and gives up a couple of hits, and he just doesn't get wins, if not
Right.
losses, because he was giving up too many runs because too many guys are getting on base. And if you're going to be fantasy relevant, you gotta limit guys on base because nothing good comes from guys getting on base when you're a pitcher. And he just isn't fantasy relevant for me because his whip is 1.5 ish. I don't know the exact
Yeah.
number.
It's hard to justify starting a pitcher in fantasy when you know they're going to give up a lot of walks and hits, because regardless of whether they go 5, 6, or 7 innings, like you have to have them go 6 innings just to quantify and validate that, starting them knowing that they're going to give up 7 hits and or walk 4 or 5 people, right?
If a 2 whip is horrible, but this is a prime example. If a guy goes 6 innings and guy gets on gives up 2 base runners every inning, a hit and a walk, and he just doesn't limit hard contacts. 6 innings, 18 points, but minus 2 base runners every time. You get 6 points for a quality start, and more than likely he will say get the quality start. And he's not going to get the win. That's 9 points for a guy going deep. That 9 points doesn't do anything for you. A good pitching outing is
Right.
18, 20, 22 plus. So you got to limit guys on base. So I think whip's probably one of the best stats to look at for fantasy relevancy.
Yeah. All right, let's go back to a hitter stat that I like paying attention to. Um, Weighted runs created plus. And I was going to do OPS plus, but honestly, that's just really similar to WOBA. And I don't know. I feel like most people know what WOBA is in today's world. Like, I feel like WOBA is today's batting average. Like, sure, batting average is what it is, but most people that pay attention to the game as deeply as we do know what weighted on base average is. So for me, I like weighted runs created plus because it tries to do the same thing as WOBA does with a league average, but also like statistically weights it the same way that WOBA does. But also, how many runs do you actually value? Are you valued for your team, right? Um, and for me, I think it's the closest thing that I've found stat wise for a hitter that will tell you where he's going to be in a fantasy. If you're looking at the top scorers in fantasy, like for me, it's the closest thing I've seen to, hey, here's how many points this guy will score for you on a week to week, to the end of year basis, right? What do you think about weighted runs created plus or OPS plus or?
Yeah, I think all the plus statistics in general normalize league average to 100, and if you're 120, you're basically 20% better than the league average player. If you're an 80, you're 20% worse than the league average player. And I think I've said this many times. I think other people have as well. You don't want a league average player in fantasy.
Right.
Might be fine for if you're trying to win a World Series. You get a handful of league average players. If your OPS plus for the year is 100, that's pretty good for the team. I mean, but in fantasy, you need the top 10 players at each position to win a
Yep.
championship. And I like that statistic because you can look at it and say, oh, guy's got a 123 OPS plus or WRC plus. And what does that really tell me? It just means he's consistently performing 20% better than league average player, plays at a high level. And so it's not going to be the tell all because it also factors in defense for WRC plus, which is why
Right.
OPS plus is a little bit better. You get that on base plus slugging, and guys getting on base and guys hitting the ball hard, hitting home runs, doubles, triples. I think OPS plus for fantasy is more relevant, but um, I think it's a quick thing if you're just looking at the list. Like, all right, who's got a high one? Oh, that guy, 140. He's on waivers. Let me go check at it. Like,
Right. Right.
why does he have 140? Um, and it,
Yeah, the one thing that I like WRC plus for additionally that I don't, it takes into the to account the park factor, right? So if you're playing in Cincinnati, you're gonna get, I would say, more credit for, it's going to average out. So it's going to be, if you're hitting in a hitter friendly park, you're going to get less credit for larger damage. Whereas if you're hitting in a non-hitter friendly park, like say you're a right-handed hitter into Camden Yards, you're going to get more credit for WCR plus for doing more damage.
Because maybe that hit should have been a home run at 29 other ballparks, but it wasn't. And
Exactly.
it doesn't ding you for the out because it says, well, if you'd have hit this
Right.
in
And so
Colorado, that's a home run.
to the definition, right? It says it attempts to credit a hitter for the value of each outcome rather than treating all hits or times on base equally, which is true, right? Especially in fantasy, because if I walk and I'm on base, like that gives me 1 point, but if I hit a double, that's 2 points. So, times on base aren't created equal in
But
fantasy.
I guess to play devil's advocate on that, I don't care what you should have done. If you played at Baltimore and you should have hit a ton of home runs and you're not hitting any home runs, you're not helping me in fantasy. What
Yep.
I want you to do is play it at the Reds out in Colorado. I want you to take advantage of the Green Monster
Yep.
and actually get those hits, get those home runs. So, uh, you know, that's why I don't like WRC Plus as much because I don't care what you should have done. I want to know what you can do and are doing.
So I'm going to WCR plus leaders right now. Shohei Ohtani is number one with 182. Yandy Diaz, number two with 166. Acuna, number three with 165. Luis Ariz, number four with 158. So based on everything else we've talked about, when we talked about, Ariz a little earlier, what are your thoughts on that? Right? Because in transparency, I do have Ariz on my team. I paid the minimum for him. I paid him $1. So I love him as my second baseman. I don't expect much out of him, but I also don't have to worry about him.
Yeah, I think WRC Plus just tells you look at this guy and see if he's worth adding, trading for. But that's not going to tell you everything because it doesn't tell you steals, it doesn't tell you home runs, it doesn't tell you how many times their batting average. It says this guy's doing something that's really good, and their fantasy value is very dependent on, especially in categories versus points, steals or home runs or hits. And Luis Rise to me, his value is pretty low because all he does is get singles versus somebody like, um, Freddie Freeman, who's just hitting doubles and triples and gets some stolen bases and hitting home runs.
Right.
His average is significantly lower, but I would much rather have Freddie Freeman than Luis Rise, even though the WRC plus is less.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because, even though Freddie Freeman's significantly lower in batting average, he's still like, what, 320? And he's going to do a lot more damage, right? Ariz has hit 3 home runs. I think Freddie's at like 15.
Yeah. Again, I think it's just a good, quick way to say, hey, these are the top guys you should take a look at, but it doesn't tell you who you should pick up or trade for.
Yeah. Freddie's at 14. So, and he's also, dude, Freddie Freeman his strikeout rate is insane. He's striking out at 17% right now.
Yeah, WRC
And it,
Plus doesn't tell you that.
right. And that's another great point, right? So like it doesn't take into account strikeouts, which I don't know if there is a stat that takes into account strikeouts the way it does factor in for fantasy.
OPS Plus would, because it's your on base. You're not getting on base. You're not getting OPS. It's not negatively impacting you like a strikeout
Like
would
a
for
strikeout
fantasy,
would, right?
but it does lower your OPS if you're doing it a lot. I don't know.
Yeah.
There's not a perfect one for that.
There was one more I wanted to find on here before we close this one out. I know
All right.
I know you and I both love this one. Stuff Plus.
Oh yeah, for pitchers.
It's one of my favorite ones. I just don't ever remember where to find it on Fangraphs. So
That one's hard to figure out because you can have a, Sirius is the one who led this. If you're
yeah,
interested, Stuff Plus. What Wes is going to find definition basically does the same thing. Averages or normalizes to the rest of the league what your fastball does, what your slider, what your curveball, um, and how impressive it is, how much quote unquote stuff you've got. So if you've got a 120 fastball, Stuff Plus, your fastball is 20% better. Got more rise, got more velocity, got more
yeah.
break, and just harder to hit than the average fastball.
So Stuff Plus looks only at the physical characteristics of a pitch. Important features include, but are not limited to. Yeah, it's funny they had to put that in there. But not limited to release point, velocity, vertical and or horizontal movement, and spin rate. I didn't know they took into account release point. So a pitcher's secondary pitches are defined based on their primary fastball, with primary defined by usage in an outing. So essentially, Stuff Plus tries to quantify like the value of how good a singular pitch is, right?
Like Jacob DeGrom has 150 Stuff Plus and everything probably when he's actually
Yeah,
pitching. I think Spencer, and I don't have the list in front of me, but Spencer Strider's probably got one of the best fastballs in the league. It's got a good rise effect. It's got high velocity, and it doesn't dip like the average fastball. The gravity take it to effect. It's got such good backspin that the ball stays elevated for longer, and so that makes it different than what a pitcher or what a batter sees every day. And so that for that
yeah,
reason, it's deceptive. So it's good quote stuff, and it's one of the best Stuff Pluses. You probably have a changeup from Luis Castillo. It's probably one of the best Stuff Plus changeups. It's just got a lot of velocity differential from his fastball, and it drops a lot.
you
I'm trying to
said
think of some of
Luis
the other.
Castillo.
Yeah, he's probably got one of the better
Yeah, his
changeups.
changeup is just nasty.
Like I can't think of everybody's best pitch off the top of my head, but those are the two pitchers that stand out to me with probably the highest Stuff Plus on a single pitch.
Yeah, I think I
Probably,
like Stuff Plus because a guy like a Cal Hendricks, like he's not going to be high on the Stuff Plus board, but it's one of those things where Stuff Plus, you see a Spencer Strider pitch and you're like, oh my God, this guy lights up the radar gun. He's got a nasty slider. Like where does he rank in that top tier of pitchers in like just pure stuff, right? And I think for me, Stuff Plus is good when you get like a Bryce Miller coming up, or you get like a Bobby Miller coming up, and you start accruing data on like these guys that have like 99 to 102 in their back pocket. And you're like, okay, well, yes, he lights up the radar gun, but where does his stuff actually rank among current big leaguers? So then I can kind of compare them where they are based on a Jacob DeGrom, who's kind of the golden standard of Stuff Plus, right?
yeah, that's a good point. Um, and it doesn't take a lot of data to get that. You can have one start, and they throw enough fastballs to know basically where your Stuff Plus lands after one game. Where one game for a batter who has four at bats, you don't like they have a bad day. It doesn't tell you anything.
Yeah. Yeah. So, um, those are some of the the stats we really pay attention to if we're on the waiver wire, or if you're checking out a guy and you really want to know how good he is and how he compares stat wise. Those are some of the stats we'd paid attention to, especially if you're looking for pitchers. Whip is definitely probably the first one. ERA is not as important because it's not as predictive. For me, I like what weighted runs created plus. Tommy, not quite for it, but OPS plus, I
More OPS
100%
plus.
agree. Like, I 100% agree. OPS plus is probably one of uh, the most predictive stats for fantasy. So I'd say the one thing Tommy and I love looking at are graphs. If you guys haven't seen it and you're listening to the episode and you made it this far with us, go into Fangraphs, go into a singular player page. They have this little tab called graphs, and then go by game. Tommy's posted a few graphics of this before. Honestly, I've been using this to really, if I'm trying to make a decision on who to start, this is kind of where I go to if I'm teetering in between my Ty France or Andrew Vaughn each week. See who's hot in the last 7 games. So for me, Tommy, anything else to add on stats before we close this one out?
No, this is a good episode. I think a lot of people are going to be trying to figure out what we were talking about half the time. Uh, but just we talked about formulas. We talked about expected versus regular. Do some googling. All that's fairly readily available on Baseball Reference, Fangraphs, MLB.com. A lot of good information that helps you understand this if you're curious about deeper dive to what we look at every day as nerds.
Yeah. I think for me, it's if you're new to fantasy, you hear terms like XWOBA, XBA, and terms like that. And for new fantasy players, like they might have no idea what that actually means, right? They might not be nerds like me and Tommy. So I think it's important to really understand in today's world of baseball because all of those things are tracked now. And it's more than just the ERA. It's more than just the batting average. So yeah. Hey, hit us up on Twitter. If you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcast, rate us, give us 5 star, hit that follow button, ask us questions. We love to interact with our guests and our fans. We're active on Twitter. Send us questions. We love interacting. So for me, for Tommy, this has been episode 30 of Fantasy Baseball Camp, and we'll catch you guys next time.